speaking of which, this is a 108-page proposed rule that the ATF just dropped, that the White House just announced. I don't think either one of us has gotten through every 108 page, but we have both gone through a significant portion of it. And I think the most important aspects are fairly well covered. So why don't we just start off with what's your bottom line takeaway? What's your first reaction to this news?
I thought it was interesting because last March, Biden said that he had reached the limits of his executive authority on guns, right? I can't do anything more. It's up to Congress. And lo and behold, about 3 weeks after all of the major gun control groups announced their endorsement for his reelection bid, he pulls this rabbit out of his hat and says, I found something else I can do. And I understand that this has actually been, the ATF's been looking at this for some time. This has been sort of the worst kept secret in D.C. for the past few months that this was coming.
Yeah.
What's interesting to me is that there are a couple of things. I think it was the White House fact sheet that was released in conjunction with this proposal said that, this makes clear there is no gun show loophole or internet sale loophole. And I don't think that there ever was a quote unquote gun show loophole, right? The question has always been, if you are in the business of selling a firearm, you have to have an FFL. So who's in the business of selling firearms, right? And that's what this proposal is all about. And it expands, I think, the definition of who is engaged in the business of selling a firearm. It doesn't encompass every private gun owner. It doesn't encompass every private sale of a firearm. But it does, I think, as you say, this is 108 pages, right? The ATF says that they're trying to offer clarity here. And I'm not really sure that they've done that. Much like their rules on stabilizing braces and frames and receivers, there still seems to be a lot of opaqueness to these rules and not transparency.
Yeah, you know what? I think that's definitely a fair takeaway that I would agree with. In the end, is like, as much as they've written out here, you still get a lot of sections where it's a bit murky, right? Like, the idea is you have to get a license if you're engaged in the business, and engaged in the business means that Congress just changed the definition recently, and we'll get into that a little bit. But you're supposed to be profiting from your gun sales. It's supposed to be for that purpose, that you're selling guns to make a living. Well, not make a living anymore, but predominantly profit, which is, I don't know how that's very different from make a living, but we'll get into a little bit of that. And, there seems to be no real standard for how many guns you can sell and how much money you can make off of them, like a profit margin or something like that is not in this rule. That perhaps one of the biggest takeaways may be what's not in there compared to what is.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think it's a really good point, because under the standards that ATF's proposing, you don't even have to make a profit, right? In fact, you don't even have to actually sell the firearm. It's just if your motivation, they determine, was to derive a profit from the sale of these firearms, then you are engaged in the business, right? And you need to have an FFL license. One of the things that they talk about as a sort of evidence that someone's engaged in the business is simply renting a table at a gun show, which I think is a very broad standard. Now, they also talk about, well, if you have business cards, if you tell somebody as you're selling a firearm, hey, I can get more for you, that's an indication that someone's engaged in the business. And again, all of these things are indications. There is no clear, bright line. When it gets to, FFLs that are disposing of their inventory, I think the nature of the rule is a little more clear. But I still think that there are going to be a lot of, everyday gun owners who are rightfully going to be concerned about whether or not the government is going to see them selling a firearm to a friend or a neighbor as engaged in the business, right?
Yeah, I think that's been a concern to this point, and probably will remain a concern to some degree under this new rule as well. And honestly, if you read the rule, and the ATF has talked about this in the past as well, and they've kept, somewhat surprisingly, a fairly consistent line on this, given the agency's track record in other areas. But they don't want necessarily to give you a full definition of these things, because they want to have flexibility when prosecuting people. I think that's just sort of the bottom line. They don't want to tell you that you can sell up to 10 guns a year. They talk about it in the rule specifically because they think people will use that floor to try and bypass these restrictions, and they don't want to allow that to happen. So they want to give themselves a lot of flexibility, which is another thing that the ATF likes to have. Most federal agencies, right, like to have more power than they might say they need, because they want to be able to go after people that they have determined are a problem. And obviously the issue with that is it leaves lots of people who aren't criminals in a gray area, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, of course, the government wants flexibility. The question is whether or not they should have that flexibility to broaden the scope of their prosecutions, as opposed to providing that clear, bright line. If the rule was, listen, if you sell more than X number of guns per year, whether that's 6, 10, 12, 20, whatever, honestly, the ATF's argument is, well, people would try to, skate right up to that line, or maybe try to find another way around it. Look, people who are selling guns illicitly, who really are engaged in the business and don't have an FFL, they're going to continue to do that, no matter what the rules are. The advantage of having that clear, bright rule and of having that transparency that the average gun owner can follow, it would make prosecution more difficult for the ATF, but it would make it easier to obey the law for everybody else. And isn't that supposed to be the point?